Deputy Owen Murphy.
Chairman, thank you, Mr. Burke. You're very welcome. You were head of banking supervision from 2006 to 2008, May 2006.
Yeah.
So did that come with supervisory powers of the banks?
Well, it came with the powers that we had imposed on the banks, if you follow me. It came with the power to supervise the banks in line with the approach and the strategy the central bank had taken.
Okay.
The regulator had taken. I beg your pardon.
In evidence from Mr. Hurley, he said that the central bank was divested of supervisory powers over financial institutions after the 2003 Act. So would you agree with that statement?
The supervisory powers, the direct micro-prudential supervisory powers, were a matter for IFSRA, which was, as far as I'm concerned, a constituent part of the wider CBFSAI.
Okay, but as head of banking supervision, did you have supervisory powers over the banks?
Yes, I had the powers that the authority gave me.
Okay.
And not all of the powers that were necessarily delegated to my level, if you follow me, but I had powers.
So after the 2003 Act, the central bank still had supervisory powers over the financial institutions?
No, the supervisory powers were with the authority, the IFSRA, but it was a constituent part of a wider organisation.
Okay, but just trying to clarify.
I'm obviously losing the plot here slightly.
With banking supervision, and you were involved with stress tests, I know you weren't, but the role was you had the power to set then parameters for stress tests with the banks to get them to conduct a stress test and to set the scenarios by which they do that.
Okay, I can't speak for how the scenarios were developed in 2006 because it was before my time. The overall responsibility for running the stress test had moved from banking supervision, which seemed to be taking the lead. Again, I can only deduce this from the documentation provided to me. In 2004, the correspondence was issuing from banking supervision. By the time we got to 2006, that responsibility was with the central bank. The extent to which they engaged with the then management in banking supervision as to the scenarios and the stresses, I can't speak to. I am, however, aware that the IMF also had input, but I can't speak to you as to how much input BSD had.
And then, as head of banking supervision, were you involved in the domestic standing group at all?
I wasn't. I was asked to attend one meeting at some point because I think it's my reference earlier to being parachuted into meetings. I think they wanted two people from the regulator there for that meeting and there was nobody else in the building. Or I was the next most senior person, might be a better way of putting it. There were clearly people in the building, and I was asked to attend.
And did you take part in the crisis simulation exercise, in late 2007, which dealt with the collapse of the bank?
I didn't in any meaningful sense. There was various functions assigned to people. My recollection is that I was asked to be responsible for the coordination of gathering any information requests that may emanate from the authority. So there were people in various rooms. The Department of Finance was in one room. The boardroom was used by the authority and senior executives from the regulator. I wasn't in there as part of that discussion, so I don't know the cut and thrust of the debate. I was in, for the want of a better word, an ante-room, dealing with any requests that may emanate from them for information.
Okay. Were you involved in preparing or reviewing the scoping paper that was prepared by the Department of Finance in late 2007 that dealt with possible nationalisation, liquidation or guaranteeing of a bank?
Not in any meaningful way that I can recall. Now, there were...
Thank you.
Pardon?
Sorry. Just 2 minutes.
Okay, that's fine by me, Deputy. Not in any meaningful way. I have said earlier that there were so many meetings at that time and you were parachuted in and out of meetings. I cannot say to you that I wasn't at some meeting where something was discussed, but I certainly wasn't hands-on in developing it.
Okay, and then were you consulted on Mr. Hurley's approach to the banks in March 2008, where he asked the banks to continue lending to each other?
No.
You weren't? Okay. I'm just curious, as head of banking supervision, that you weren't involved in the domestic standing group as an active member, a regular member. You weren't in the room for the crisis simulation exercise. You didn't have a direct role in the scoping paper prepared looking at the nationalisation or liquidation, or guaranteeing of the banks. And you weren't aware that the governor was approaching the banks directly to ask them to lend to each other. Can I ask why that is?
I'm not sure I can tell you why that is, Deputy. You would need to ask some of the people that didn't approach me on various things. In fairness to people at that time, it was very fast-moving. There was a lot of issues being dealt with. My impression was strategically at the level of the 7th floor. The more issues came, the more BSD became operational and much less strategic. We were literally firefighting, and there were constant demands for information, be it why we didn't regulate conduits to what the liquidity position on a particular bank was, etc. And I think, given the resource constraints within the wider organisation, the 7th floor and our executives became far more involved in those sort of strategic discussions, where in a more calm business as usual mode, perhaps you might have expected the head of banking supervision to be involved. I can only tell you, my evidence is I was not involved.
Can I just clarify how many positions were above you between yourself and, say, Mr. Grimes, the Deputy Governor?
Well, I wasn't on a direct reporting line to Mr. Grimes. Above me, there was the Prudential Director, there was the CEO, and they reported directly into the authority. Mr. Grimes was on the other pillar, for the want of a better word.
Okay, thank you.